The wind carried the ghost of an era, whispering through the bamboo groves of Kagoshima like a lament for a world about to vanish. Kirino Toshiaki watched his oldest friend, Saigo Takamori, silhouetted against the setting sun, and knew that the heart of Japan was about to break. The late afternoon light painted Saigo in hues of amber and rust. His massive frame seemingly carved from the very mountain stone of their beloved Satsuma domain. He stood motionless, a living monument to a way of life that was rapidly dissolving like mist before the harsh dawn of modernity. Kirino had known Saigo for decades. They had been more than friends, more than brothers in arms. They were the beating heart of a samurai tradition that now trembled on the precipice of extinction. "They are dismantling everything," Saigo said, his voice a low rumble that seemed to emerge from the depths of the earth itself. His hand, calloused from decades of sword practice, gripped a letter from Tokyo, another imperial decree that chipped away at the foundation of their warrior culture. Kirino stepped closer, the gravel crunching beneath his feet. The landscape around them was a study in contradiction. Ancient stone walls of their clan's compound stood resolute, while in the distance, new Western-style buildings rose like alien constructs, their geometric lines a stark contrast to the organic curves of traditional Japanese architecture. "The Meiji government grows bolder by the day," Kirino responded, his own hand unconsciously touching the hilt of his katana. The weapon felt different now, no longer a symbol of absolute authority, but a relic of a dying world. Saigo turned, and Kirino saw the storm brewing in his eyes. They were not the eyes of a defeated man, but of a warrior whose spirit burned with an intensity that could consume entire landscapes. At 45, Saigo was a mountain of a man, broad-shouldered, with a face that seemed carved from weathered granite, bearing the scars of countless battles and the weight of an entire cultural transformation. The recent imperial reforms had systematically dismantled everything the samurai class represented. The sword ban of 1876 was more than a mere administrative decree. It was a surgical excision of their very identity. Samurai were forbidden from wearing their traditional two swords. Their stipends were being eliminated, and their social status had been reduced to that of ordinary citizens. "They call it progress," Saigo said, a bitter edge cutting through his typically measured tone. "But progress that erases 1,000 years of tradition is not progress. It is cultural assassination." Kirino understood. They had both served the Tokugawa shogunate, then pivotally supported the Meiji Restoration, believing they were creating a stronger Japan. Now they felt like architects whose most cherished design had been callously demolished and replaced with a structure they barely recognized. The compound around them bore witness to their legacy. Stone walls that had protected their clan for generations now seemed to whisper of impending change. Young samurai trained in the courtyard, their movements a beautiful, deadly dance that felt increasingly anachronistic. Modern rifles leaned against traditional weapon racks, a visual metaphor of the collision between old and new. "We are not merely fighting a government," Saigo continued, his massive hand sweeping across the landscape. "We are fighting for the soul of Japan, a soul that remembers honor, discipline, and the sacred bond between a warrior and his people." Kirino knew what was coming. The whispers had been growing, first a murmur, then a roar. Resistance, rebellion, words that tasted of both hope and desperation. "The government believes they can erase us with decrees and modern weapons," Saigo said, a dangerous glint entering his eyes. "They do not understand that a warrior's spirit cannot be legislated out of existence." As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the Satsuma landscape, Kirino felt the weight of history pressing against them. They were standing at a precipice, and the choice they would make would echo through generations. The rebellion was no longer a possibility. It was an inevitability, and Saigo Takamori would be its flame. The night breathed with the weight of 1,000 unspoken revolutions, each shadow in Saigo Takamori's study a silent conspirator to a drama that would reshape the very soul of Japan. Candlelight flickered against walls lined with scrolls, ancient wisdom and imperial decrees intertwined like combatants, locked in an eternal embrace, their edges curling with the heat of impending conflict. The cedar table before them was more than mere furniture. It was an altar of transformation, scattered with maps that bore the cartographic scars of a changing nation. Topographical lines cut through the paper like wounds, mountain passes and coastal regions marked with the precision of warriors who understood that geography was the first language of survival. Shinohara Tokujiro leaned forward, his lean frame a coiled spring of potential energy. Decades of martial training had stripped away any excess, leaving behind a human weapon whose every movement spoke of calculated intent. His fingers, calloused from sword and pen alike, traced potential battle routes with a meticulousness that bordered on reverence. "Listen," Shinohara said, his voice a low rumble that seemed to emerge from the very bedrock of Satsuma province. "Our network grows like underground roots. In every village, in every mountain hamlet, former samurai are preparing. Not with hope, but with the cold certainty of those who have nothing left to lose." The room itself seemed to listen. Traditional shoji screens filtered the moonlight, creating a chiaroscuro of rebellion. Light and shadow dancing their own intricate war dance. Outside, Kagoshima's volcanic landscape stood as both witness and participant, its ancient stone a testament to resistance, to survival against impossible odds. Kirino Toshiaki studied an imperial decree, its official seal a mockery of the cultural decimation it represented. The paper felt thin beneath his fingers, fragile, much like the rapidly dissolving world of the samurai. Each character was a knife, systematically dismembering their centuries-old tradition. Saigo Takamori remained motionless, a human mountain whose very presence seemed to draw the room's energy toward him. At 45, he was both an anachronism and a prophecy, a living bridge between Japan's feudal past and its uncertain future. His massive frame contained contradictions, the gentleness of a scholar, the ferocity of a warrior, the vision of a revolutionary. "We are witnessing the death of an era," Saigo finally spoke, his voice carrying the weight of generations. "But death is not an end, it is a transformation." Yuko, his wife, entered with a tea service that seemed to float between the men like a delicate peace offering. Her movements were a subtle rebellion, graceful, deliberate, carrying generations of samurai refinement. Steam rose from the ceramic cups, ghost-like tendrils that seemed to whisper their own stories of resistance and resilience. As she placed the tray down, her fingers briefly touched her husband's massive hand. No words were exchanged, but volumes of understanding passed between them. She knew the personal cost of rebellion. Families destroyed, generations scattered, cultural memory potentially erased. Masaru, Kirino's 16-year-old son, stood in the doorway. Unlike the older warriors, he embodied the impossible complexity of their moment in history. Western-style education had shaped his mind, while secret martial arts training had forged his spirit. He was a living translation, caught between two worlds, belonging fully to neither. "Tell me about the underground dojos," Masaru asked, his voice a mixture of adolescent eagerness and profound curiosity. Shinohara's eyes, sharp as the finest katana, locked with the boy's. "In mountain villages across Satsuma, we preserve more than martial techniques. We preserve our soul. Children learn sword forms by moonlight, their movements a language older than words, a resistance written in muscle and bone." The map on the table became more than a strategic document. It was a living thing, breathing with possibility. Red marks indicated potential battle zones. Blue lines traced potential movement routes. Each mark represented not just geographical locations, but the hopes, fears, and unbroken spirit of an entire cultural tradition. "The government believes technology can erase cultural memory," Saigo said, his hand unconsciously touching the empty space where his treasured katana would have hung before the sword ban. "They do not understand that a warrior's spirit is not contained in a weapon, but in the heart, in the collective memory of a people." Kirino understood the deeper currents beneath their conversation. They were architects of a resistance that transcended military strategy. This was about preserving a way of understanding the world, a philosophy of honor, discipline, and interconnectedness that modern bureaucracy sought to dismantle. The volcanic mountains of Satsuma seemed to breathe outside, their ancient stone a metaphor for resistance. immovable, unyielding. Generations of warriors had been forged in their crucible, and now those same mountains would bear witness to what might be their final stand. As midnight approached, the room became a crucible of potential. Each warrior, each scroll, each map, a potential catalyst for a transformation that would echo through generations. The old world was dying, and from its ashes, something profound would be born. The rebellion was no longer a possibility. It was an inevitability. The first light of dawn broke like a fractured promise, painting the volcanic landscape of Satsuma in hues of molten amber and bruised indigo. Distant thunder rumbled. Whether from approaching storms or the distant drumbeat of rebellion, no one could be certain. Saigo Takamori stood at the edge of his compound, watching the world transform. The morning mist rolled across the landscape like unspoken warnings, each wisp a messenger of impending revolution. His massive frame was a monument to a dying tradition, a living bridge between Japan's feudal past and its uncertain future. A messenger arrived, his horse lathered and trembling, bearing news that would crack the foundations of their carefully laid plans. The imperial government had moved beyond bureaucratic dismemberment. They were now actively hunting down key samurai leaders, branding them as enemies of progress. "They hunt us like wounded animals," muttered Shinohara Tokujiro, unfolding the message with hands that had once wielded the most precise katana in Satsuma. The imperial decree was a surgical instrument of cultural assassination, naming specific samurai leaders as traitors, promising harsh consequences for resistance. Kirino Toshiaki studied the document, his experienced eyes reading between the lines. The government's strategy was clear: divide and conquer. By targeting specific leaders, they hoped to fracture the samurai resistance before it could truly take root. But something more complex was emerging. Not all samurai would stand united. Some had already integrated into the new government structure, trading their ancestral honor for bureaucratic positions and steady income. Betrayal lurked in unexpected corners, a shadow more treacherous than any battlefield. Masaru, Kirino's son, represented the impossible complexity of their historical moment. At 16, he embodied the violent transformation consuming Japan. Western education had sharpened his intellect, while secret martial arts training had forged his spirit. He was a living translation, caught between two worlds, belonging fully to neither. "Father," Masaru said, his voice carrying a mixture of adolescent uncertainty and profound insight, "the rebellion cannot be about preservation. It must be about evolution." The words hung in the air like a challenge, forcing the older warriors to confront the philosophical heart of their resistance. This was more than a military conflict. This was a battle for the soul of a nation rapidly being reimagined. Yuko, Saigo's wife, moved through the preparations with a grace that belied the violence brewing around them. Her hands, which had once embroidered delicate kimonos, now packed medical supplies and prepared provisions. Women like her were the true architects of resistance, their quiet strength a foundation more enduring than any warrior's sword. Intelligence networks spread like underground roots. In mountain villages, in coastal hamlets, in the heart of Kagoshima. Former samurai shared information through intricate communication channels. Coded messages passed between trusted allies, each transmission a potential lifeline or a fatal vulnerability. Shinohara revealed their most dangerous intelligence. A high-ranking government official, someone close to the inner circles of power, was sympathetic to their cause. Not out of sentiment, but out of a complex understanding that the wholesale destruction of the samurai class would rob Japan of its most experienced warriors, its living historical memory. "We are not fighting against modernization," Saigo proclaimed, his voice a thunderous declaration that seemed to resonate with the very volcanic stone of their homeland. "We are fighting for the soul of Japan, a soul that remembers its past while embracing its future." The landscape around them seemed to listen. Volcanic mountains stood as silent witnesses, their geological memory spanning millennia. They had seen empires rise and fall, watched civilizations transform. To these ancient stones, the current conflict was but a momentary breath in an endless narrative. Alliances shifted like tectonic plates. Some samurai saw the rebellion as a noble last stand. Others viewed it as a necessary sacrifice to preserve their cultural essence. And a few, the most dangerous, saw an opportunity for personal elevation amidst the chaos. A letter arrived from an unexpected source. A government official, someone they had considered a potential enemy, offered a nuanced perspective. The message suggested that not all modernization was a destruction of tradition. Some saw the potential for a Japan that could honor its past while embracing technological progress. But for Saigo and his closest allies, the line had been drawn. The sword ban, the systematic dismemberment of their social structure, the constant erosion of their cultural identity. These were wounds that could not be simply healed through bureaucratic compromise. As evening approached, the compound became a hive of quiet preparation. Weapons were carefully maintained, not just as tools of potential conflict, but as repositories of cultural memory. Each sword, each piece of armor, carried the stories of generations, a living history that could not be legislated out of existence. Masaru watched his father and Saigo prepare, understanding that he was witnessing a transformation larger than any individual. This was about the birth of a new national identity, forged in the crucible of conflict and philosophical reimagining. The storm was gathering, and when it broke, Japan would never be the same. The mountain of Shiroyama rose like a final breath of defiance against the relentless tide of modernity, its volcanic stone bearing witness to humanity's most profound moments of transformation. Dawn broke with a terrible beauty, painting the landscape in hues of blood and steel. Saigo Takamori stood at the epicenter of his final rebellion. Surrounded by fewer than 500 samurai, a mere handful of warriors against an imperial army of nearly 3,000 modern-equipped soldiers. The disparity was not a source of despair, but of a transcendent clarity that comes when one understands the true meaning of sacrifice. Kirino Toshiaki moved beside his lifelong friend, their bond tempered by decades of shared struggle. The morning mist clung to the mountainside like funeral shrouds, obscuring the boundary between earth and sky, between life and the imminent moment of legend. "We are not just fighting a battle," Saigo said, his voice a low rumble that seemed to emerge from the very bedrock of their homeland. "We are preserving the soul of Japan." The Imperial artillery began their thunderous preparation, modern cannons speaking a language of destruction that the samurai's traditional weapons could never comprehend. Each boom was a punctuation mark in the sentence of cultural extinction, a mechanical roar declaring the death of an era. Shinohara Tokujiro moved among the warriors, a living embodiment of preparation and resolve. His movements were precise, each gesture a culmination of generations of martial training. Young samurai watched him with a mixture of terror and reverence, understanding they were witnessing the final act of a centuries-old tradition. Masaru, Kirino's son, stood close to Saigo, no longer a boy, but a warrior forged in the crucible of transformation. His Western education and traditional martial training had prepared him for this moment of ultimate contradiction. He was the bridge between two worlds, about to witness their violent collision. The first wave of Imperial troops advanced like a mechanical organism, their Western rifles cutting precise lines through the mountain landscape. Modern artillery created wounds in the earth, explosions that reshuffled the very topology of Shiroyama. Saigo's samurai were not merely fighting, they were performing a final, magnificent ritual, a dance of cultural memory that would be remembered long after their bodies had returned to the volcanic soil of their homeland. "Remember," Saigo called to his warriors, "we fight not just with weapons, but with the accumulated spirit of generations. Each of us carries the honor of our ancestors. Each of us is a living scroll of our nation's deepest truths." The battle unfolded with a terrible, beautiful precision. Samurai charged against rifle fire, their katanas gleaming like captured lightning. Their movements a poetry of resistance that would be sung in whispers for generations. Modern weaponry spoke its language of efficient destruction, while the samurai responded with a dialect of honor that transcended mere survival. Kirino fought beside Saigo, their movements synchronized by decades of brotherhood. Each sword stroke was more than a combat technique. It was a philosophical statement, a refusal to be erased by the mechanical march of progress. Imperial troops advanced methodically, their rifles creating a wall of death that consumed the samurai ranks with mathematical precision. But numbers were irrelevant. This was a battle about spirit, about the ineffable quality that transforms mere men into legends. As the day progressed, the mountain became a canvas of ultimate sacrifice. Bodies of samurai warriors lay like fallen poetry against the volcanic stone, their blood seeping into earth that had witnessed countless transformations. The imperial troops, for all their technological superiority, could not help but feel the profound weight of what they were destroying. Saigo Takamori stood at the center of the maelstrom, a human monument to resistance. Wounded but unbroken, he represented something larger than individual survival. He was the living embodiment of a cultural memory that refused to be forgotten. In his final moments, surrounded by the remnants of his warriors, Saigo understood the profound irony of their struggle. They were not fighting against progress, but for the soul of a nation that was rapidly forgetting its own heart. As imperial rifles found their mark, Saigo fell, not in defeat, but in ultimate triumph. His body collapsed, but his spirit seemed to rise, merging with the volcanic landscape that had birthed him. Kirino, mortally wounded, dragged himself to his friend's side. Their eyes met. A final communication that transcended words. A shared understanding of their place in the grand narrative of their nation. The Battle of Shiroyama was over. The samurai era had ended, but a new chapter of Japan was about to begin. Decades would pass, and Japan would transform beyond recognition. The volcanic mountains of Satsuma would continue to stand, silent witnesses to humanity's endless capacity for reinvention. In Tokyo's museums, in quiet academic halls, in the whispered stories of families, the tale of Saigo Takamori would become more than history. It would become mythology, a profound meditation on honor, resistance, and the delicate dance between tradition and progress. The samurai did not truly die. They evolved, their spirit becoming the invisible foundation of a new Japan, a nation that would remember its past while racing toward an unimaginable future. And Shiroyama, that mountain of ultimate sacrifice, would remain, a geographical metaphor for transformation, a stone testament to the moment when an entire way of life chose dignity over surrender.